Okay, continuing our conversation about church reform in the High Middle Ages. I mentioned in the last video that there were three major issues that churchmen, by the beginning of the 11th century, and there were certainly concerns about these things before that, but it really starts to get to turn into a movement for church reform by the beginning of the 11th century. And there were a circle of reformers in Rome. There were like-minded people in other towns and cities across Christendom who were interested in ending corruption, and even the major powers were interested in figuring out a way to make the church a more holy and kind of higher institution, a more admirable institution than it had been in earlier eras, right? And so this circle of church reformers kind of came to power in Rome by the middle of the 11th century. And some of this was due to the patronage of the German emperor. This is ironic given what happens a few decades after this, but the German Emperor Henry III in particular was very invested in trying to reform the papacy from the time of the Carolingians, or even going back to Clovis, the Merovingian. The Frankish kings, some of whom held the title of emperor, of course, from Charlemagne on, right, had been involved in the church in Rome, had been protectors of the Pope, had been allies of the papacy, and had been, we might say, overseers of the papacy and its projects, its actions. Okay, and so the German emperors were very concerned about the state of the church, and trying to wrest the papacy away from the stranglehold that these powerful noble families in Italy had on it. And so the Pope, who was elected in the year 1049 and served until 1054, was actually the cousin of Emperor Henry III. I don't know exactly, what the relationship was, whether it was a first cousin or a more distant cousin, but they were related. And this is Pope Leo IX. This image on the right here is a manuscript illustration of Leo. You can see the word Leo there, right next to it. Leo Papa, Pope Leo. Okay. And Nonus, which is 9. So Leo IX, despite having this relationship with the emperor, he and actually because of it, because Henry III is interested in reforming the church, he immediately starts to take action against those guilty of simony and to crack down on clerical concubinage. Those are the two issues that his papacy really tried to tackle. We're not yet at a serious concern about lay investiture, partly because the German emperor is the one who is, we might say, most guilty of that, and this is his relative. But famously, Leo, even though he was from Italy, he went on a tour of other parts of Christendom. He, with his retinue in tow, he went across the Alps into France. Leo was one of the first popes of the Middle Ages to do this kind of traveling like this, right? To have the Pope leave Italy. That simply wasn't done much before this. But he goes up to France. They actually held a synod of bishops. A synod is a gathering of churchmen, especially bishops, usually to make decisions about issues that they're having in the church. And in the city of Reims, which is east of Paris, Leo presided over a synod, and according to the chronicles that detail this, he proceeded during that synod to strip a number of bishops of their titles, taking away their rings and their staffs and their positions because they were guilty of simony. And this really shocked people because, again, that was standard operating procedure. And it seems that Leo didn't make his intentions clear. He asked if anybody had concerns, and some of the bishops came up to him and said, hey, could I get like a rebate on how much I had to pay for this office? Like, this was exorbitant, and Leo was really sort of fishing when he asked if anybody had questions for those who were guilty of this kind of corruption, right? So Leo ended up giving back most of the bishoprics, but after some severe penance, and this sent a really stern message that the papacy was no longer going to tolerate simony. He also made moves to crack down on concubinage. And so Leo is known as the first reforming pope, right? But he was advised by several officials, several members of the papal curia, who would go on to wield great influence as well, one of whom became Pope Gregory VII, who I'll talk about in a minute here. The College of Cardinals dates back to the 9th century. And this is essentially the papal bureaucracy, right? So you have the papal curia, which is the court of the pope, and his core advisors hold the position of cardinal. There may be antecedents of cardinal going back even further. Saint Jerome, for instance, who of course lived in the 4th and 5th centuries, is often depicted with a cardinal's getup on, wearing the red hat and things like that. But the real College of Cardinals it's not firmly established as an entity until the early 9th century. But in the 11th century, the stature of the College of Cardinals increases tremendously. And it's at this point that the decision to have the College of Cardinals be the primary force to elect the Pope is put into place. Now, because the Emperor is still involved, there's talk about the College of Cardinals consulting with the Emperor, because he is in charge politically of Rome, and so it made sense to do that. But this is really the beginning of the church, of the independent election of the Pope by the College of Cardinals. And over time, the oversight of the Emperor, is just done away with, and the College of Cardinals is the sole body who makes that decision. And this is a really important thing, right? This takes it away from the interference of the laity, which was a big part of the corruption, the perceived corruption of the papacy in the first place. Now, one of the, we might say, spin-off results of this excitement about church reform is an event that happens in the year 1054. Over the previous few centuries, there had been a number of contentions between the leaders of the Greek church, mostly the patriarchs of Constantinople and the emperors in that city themselves, on the one side, and the Pope on the other side, especially over the issue of Petrine primacy. The Patriarch of Constantinople, of course, claimed that his position was equal to that of the Bishop of Rome, as were the patriarchates of Antioch and Alexandria and Jerusalem, right? That these are the 5 patriarchs of the church. Of course, in the West, the doctrine of Petrine primacy ruled supreme, and it was assumed that the Bishop of Rome was the most important churchman. But the other tradition in the Greek world was that the emperor was the true head of the church, that his divine sanction to rule gave him special province over spiritual affairs. We saw this with Justinian. And so that had been a point of contention. There were some other theological issues that had arisen in the early Middle Ages. During the time of Charlemagne, for instance, there was a movement in the Byzantine Empire to do away with religious images, even to destroy the images that were in existence in churches. This is called the iconoclastic movement. And the Carolingian theologians weighed in on this and drew the ire of many of the theologians in the Greek-speaking world, so that had increased the animosity between the Greek and the Latin churches. And there were issues in the 11th century, specifically over, Petrine primacy is an issue, but the other one is over the use of either leavened or unleavened bread in the celebration of the Eucharist. In the West, they use unleavened bread. In the East, it's leavened. And so, there were kind of knock them down, drag them out fights over this. And in 1054, a papal legate named Humbert, who was one of the key reformers and advisors to Leo IX, was sent as a papal representative, a legate is the word, to Constantinople to try to work out some of these theological differences. And this ended up in a big fight, and Humbert, using The authority vested in him by the Pope ended up excommunicating the Patriarch of Constantinople. The Patriarch responded by excommunicating not only Humbert, but also the Pope. And this led to, what some have called the Great Western Schism, a rupture between the two major branches of Christianity in the Middle Ages that would not be healed for a very long time, if ever. I don't know this has been fully healed. And so that, it's really, though, the reforming spirit of the West that emboldened them, I think, to the point that they were willing to try to put the Greek Christian leaders in their place. And this is one of the things that leads to the Crusades and other things, which we'll talk about later. The most important reforming pope of the 11th century was, like Humbert, one of the circle of reformers who surrounded Leo IX. He had been a key policymaker. His name was Hildebrand. He was also Italian, but living in the empire. He was elected pope in the year 1075 and took the name Gregory VII. The name Gregory was auspicious because he was really harking back to the Pope Gregory the Great, right, who was seen as the greatest of the early medieval popes. And immediately Gregory began to sort of up the stakes of the reform game. And in this case, he began to attack the German Emperor Henry IV. So this is Henry III's son. Henry was not very old at this point. He was only about 20. I'm going to think about this. When was he born? Anyway, I think he was in his early 20s when Gregory was elected, and so he had been emperor from the time he was about 6 years old, I think. There had been a regency. And so he was not the most secure, we might say, in his position. Gregory, I think, saw an opportunity to wrest power away in the church, away from the German emperors, something that, popes and these reformers had wanted to do for some time. Now, the set of documents that I've assigned you, and this is in the Geary book, of course, to the details this contention is... it's documents 41 and 42. The first of these, 41, is a set of correspondence between Gregory and Henry. And I think that Geary made an unfortunate editorial choice to put all of the correspondence of Gregory from 1075 up to 1081 first, and then to go back and do all of Henry's correspondence rather than to try to place them chronologically. Okay, and so you may have to flip some pages, or in this case, do some swipes back and forth on the digital copy to kind of see, here's what Gregory's saying in 1075, and then here's how Henry's responding, and then, here's Gregory's response to that, and then Henry says this, and it goes back and forth, right? But you can see here what the Pope is trying to do. This is a fascinating source. You want to look at political smack talk, okay? Modern politicians have nothing on these 11th century figures when it comes to the the gamesmanship of their rhetoric, and at times the clever insults that they use that they level against each other, right? And so in this first, this first one dates July 20th, 1075. This is shortly after Hildebrand, now Gregory VII, became Pope, okay? Actually, it looks like he was elected in 1073. I apologize, I had that date wrong. Yeah, and Henry was emperor from 1056, but he was born in 1050, and so he was only 6 years old when he became emperor. And, 1075, he's only 25, right? So he's still quite young. Gregory starts out by saying, look, you have done well in combating simony, and that you are strenuously enforcing the chastity of the clergy as servants of God. Those are the two issues that reformers up to this point had worked on most strenuously, right? They had tried to combat simony, and the German emperors had been involved in this, and he gives credit where credit's due. right? But then he goes on to criticize him, okay? And he says, you have bishops within your realm who you're supporting, and some of whom you appointed, who are not worthy to be bishops, right? And so, he goes on to say, you need to remove, and so this is, and I mean, it's, you have to sort of contextualize this and see why this is such a radical step, right? Here is the Pope in Rome, weighing in on the Bishop of Bamberg, which is in Franconia, central Germany. And the Pope has taken the step of removing him from his episcopal and priestly office. He has stripped him of his clerical robes, so to speak, right? Now, this is a churchman who was appointed by the emperor. And the Pope is coming in and saying he is not fit to be the bishop. And so I, on my authority, in your kingdom, am removing him from office. Okay? No emperor, no king had to suffer this. I'm thinking from the viewpoint of Henry IV here, right? This simply wasn't done. Popes didn't interfere in the governmental affairs, even if they were, it was church government within other realms. That was the province, that was the privilege, that's the right word for the Middle Ages, of the kings and the emperors. But I have removed him from office, right? And he says, you need to get on board with this, that you may be worthy of divine protection through the intercession of St. Peter, in whose name and under whose patronage the church was founded. Like, he is pulling rank here on the emperor and saying, I am the one in charge of the church. You need to get on board with this, because you, in spiritual matters, you are underneath me. Okay. And of course, Henry refuses to do that. And the next letter is dated a few months later, and he says, since you are reported to be in voluntary communication with men who are under the censure of the Apostolic See and of a synod, I'm not happy with you, right? So the emperor basically ignored this and continued to respect the Bishop of Bamberg in his position, and told him to just, not pay any attention to what the Pope was saying in Rome. And Gregory is saying now, look, now you have drawn the ire of God through his representative on earth, the Pope, because you are continuing to support this person whom I have removed from that office. And he says here, yet in action, you claim to be a loyal son of Holy Mother Church, yet in action you show yourself most bitterly hostile to the canons and apostolic decrees and those duties especially required by loyalty to the church. You are not listening to the Pope. Right? And, we could keep going through this. I've highlighted a number of things here. This just gets really interesting, in my opinion. Of course, I'm a geek for these kinds of things, but this is one of my favorite sources from the Middle Ages, okay? Here you should give more respectful attention to the master of the church, that is to Peter, Prince of the Apostles. Right, and then by early 1076, he's conducting a synod, and he is excommunicating Henry IV. Right, I deprive King Henry, and he's not just excommunicating him either. He is saying, so this is a really radical step. I deprive King Henry, son of the Emperor Henry, who has rebelled against thy church with an unheard of audacity, of the government of the whole kingdom of Germany and Italy, and I release all Christian men from the allegiance which they have sworn or may swear to him, and I forbid anyone to serve him as king. So now the Pope is, saying this is not just about his oversight of the church. I have the power to remove him entirely from the office of emperor, and to give permission to his subjects to disobey him. Talk about pulling rank, right? That's what he's doing. And in essence, the Pope is claiming here the overlordship of all Christians. Not just the spiritual overlordship, but in a way the secular overlordship as well, right? If the Pope can depose an emperor and release people from their bonds of fealty, which they took very seriously, right? That is like the ultimate power play. And this just keeps going, okay? Now, I'm going to talk about Canossa in a minute here, but I want to look over at some of the stuff that Henry is saying here. You got to kind of, yeah, here we go. Letters of Henry IV. Okay, he is writing here to his German subjects here, right? And he writes, noting particularly among the latter the monk Hildebrand. Notice he doesn't call him Pope. He says the monk Hildebrand. We urge you to enmity against him, since we have found him to be an assailant and oppressor of the church, as well as a waylayer of the Roman Commonwealth and of our kingdom, as may be known clearly from the following letters sent to him by us. And then we get, this is what Gregory said to him, right? And so he's circulating this. And notice here he's claiming king by the grace of God, right? God is the one who has appointed me. And so we need to remove him from the apostolic see, right? And appoint another pope. This guy is defunct. He is not worthy to be pope. And he goes on to give lots of reasons here. He even says, look, I know that you swore an oath. There's that word again, right? The thing that people took very seriously. To my father, that you would neither obtain the papacy yourself nor suffer another to obtain it, right? That you swore you wouldn't seek the papacy. And for some reason, like, Henry's convinced that he had made this agreement and he's violated that. And, if you violate an agreement with the emperor, you are defunct as a Christian. There's a lot of complexity to this, okay? Here's one of my favorite insults, right? This is a letter from Henry to Hildebrand. King not by usurpation, but by the pious ordination of God. To Hildebrand, not now Pope, but false monk. Right? Trash talking. And he says, you dared to threaten to take the kingship away from us, as though we had received the kingship from you, as though kingship and empire were in your hand and not in the hand of God. The audacity of it, right? And so let another mount the throne of St. Peter, another who will not cloak violence with religion, but who will teach the pure doctrine of St. Peter, which is that the church is meant to be a spiritual guide and not to interfere with political affairs, that is the province of the emperor, who is himself appointed by God to do that, right? And, this is another letter to some of his subjects. He says, it is the monk Hildebrand. This is actually to some of the clergy, I believe, to the bishops of Germany, which would include, of course, northern Italy and even Rome itself, right? It is the monk Hildebrand, a monk indeed in habit, so-called pope, who, as you yourself know clearly, presides in the apostolic see, not with the care of a pastor, but with the violence of a usurper, and from the throne of peace dissolves the bond of the one Catholic peace. To cite a few things among many, without God's knowledge, he has usurped for himself the kingship and the priesthood. Right, so he is claiming rule over both of these, power over both of these, which, of course, in the view of Henry, is absurd. Now, there's a lot of high drama involved in this. In the year 1077, and this is actually detailed in some of the Gregory material, the emperor decided to march an army down into Italy to essentially take Gregory captive and remove him forcibly from the papal see. Gregory outmaneuvered him, and he took his own retinue up into northern Italy, into Lombardy, and holed up in a castle which was owned by a noblewoman named Matilda, who was one of the subjects of Henry. But if Henry had attacked her castle, this would have been really a declaration of war against his nobles, right? And remember, the German emperors were always having to walk a fine balance between offending the nobles of their realm and things like this. And so, he's on a political knife's edge here. And Gregory has holed up in this castle and basically said, I dare you to come attack this castle. Henry, knowing that he had been outmaneuvered, ended up doing penance, and Gregory even describes this, it seems with some glee here. There, on 3 successive days, standing before the castle gate, laying aside all royal insignia, barefooted and in coarse attire. Notice this is in January, by the way, so it was very cold, probably snow on the ground. He ceased not with many tears to beseech the apostolic help and comfort, until all who were present or who had heard the story were so moved by pity and compassion that they pleaded his cause with prayers and tears. It's like, he is legit. He is really trying to repent. And so, Gregory lifted the sentence of excommunication and, kind of restored to him the emperorship. But almost immediately after this, the fight started up again. This continued into the 1080s. Gregory actually called for help from the Normans of Sicily and southern Italy, and this nearly led to a massive war between the two. But both of them really ended up losing power over this. A lot of people began to rebel against Henry because of his continued perceived control of the church, illegitimate control of the church. Gregory at one point had to flee Rome under the protection of the Norman kings in southern Italy, but he never made it back to Rome. They essentially took him captive, right, to protect him ostensibly, but he was a bargaining chip for them, right, to gain greater power over the region. And so Gregory ended up dying kind of in captivity in 1085. Now, after this, so anyway, we can talk more about this document in the live session or on discussion boards, but I would just encourage you to read through this. It's truly fascinating to see the kind of political gamesmanship going on between these two powerful figures. This contention, by the way, has been called the investiture controversy, largely because the settlement that comes out of this. So during the lifetime of both of these individuals, this was not settled. But a generation later, let me get to the end of this document. In the year 1122, Henry V, the son of Henry IV, actually, he might be the grandson, 1106, I think it's his grandson, because I think Conrad is the son of Henry who rules after him. But in any case, I'm sorry if I'm not remembering the emperors correctly. But Pope Calixtus II, who was, by the way, a Cistercian, the first Cistercian pope, and Henry V end up making an agreement which is called the Concordat of Worms. Worms being a city in Germany, not the crawly things that were in the ground. So the Concordat of Worms, and this settlement basically says, okay, so the emperor says, I do surrender to God and to the holy apostles of God, Peter and Paul, and to the Holy Catholic Church, all investiture through ring and staff. So investiture itself, the ritual of investiture, is not the power to invest the bishop with the insignia of his office that I will no longer have that power. But on the other hand, that the Pope then says, well, the elections of bishops and abbots of the German kingdom who belong to that kingdom shall take place in the presence of the emperor without simony or any violence. And the one elected shall receive the regalia from the emperor, he's talking here to the emperor, by the scepter, meaning the emperor sort of presides over this and holds his scepter there as the ring and the staff are presented. And the bishop will be loyal to, or he will perform lawful duties to the emperor, meaning he will keep the laws of the empire. And so this is a compromise, but it's really more of a victory for the papacy than it is for the empire, right? And this doesn't end the contention by any means. I think it's more about this document that leads to the title of investiture controversy, because the settlement was about the issue of investiture. But if you look back at the correspondence between Gregory and Henry, there's very little talk about the act of investiture, right? It's really more about like the power to make and unmake bishops, to control church offices, which I suppose involves investiture. but it's really more fundamental than that, right? It's a power play. It's a question of who has ultimate power in Christendom. And so we might say that this is the power controversy of the 11th and 12th centuries. But investor controversy is the common term for this. Okay. There are later contentions between secular authorities and spiritual authorities, between popes and or bishops. One of the most famous, of course, is Henry II's contention with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, in the 1160s, leading ultimately to Thomas Becket's murder at the hands of some of Henry's knights in December of 1170, so this martyrdom led to the almost immediate sainthood of Thomas Becket and intense penance from Henry. He was not directly blamed for the death, but he had to do penance for it, right? And so this is more high drama in the Middle Ages, and it's really a question of who has charge of the church, right? The issue that they were fighting over was legal jurisdiction, that if a churchman commits a crime, should he be tried in a church court or in a secular court? The king was, and also over the appointment of churchmen and things like that. But the legal dispute was the major one there. And I mean, those are just maybe the two most famous cases from the Middle Ages of, this contention between secular authorities and ecclesiastical authorities. This has been called the crisis of church and state in the Middle Ages. But I think that these ideas of church and state as separate things really is not germane for the Middle Ages generally, right? So I would refrain, I think, from using that terminology. Okay, this is really a question of who has ultimate authority, or who has authority in what realm, in what part of medieval society. And it's a question that's never settled, and many scholars of this period, including some of the leading lights of the Middle Ages, like Dante weighs in on this in the 14th century. Marsilius of Padua was a major thinker along these lines, right? Even, figures like Bernard of Clairvaux are indirectly kind of addressing these issues. So, church reform leads to a lot of things. And indirectly, or I guess not really indirectly, more directly, church reform leads to the Crusades. Because with the reforms, with the growing power of the papacy, the church is emboldened. And it's one of these reforming popes who follows in the wake of Gregory VII, Urban II, who calls the First Crusade. And that's where we're going to turn our attention next.